Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. Greetings from Busan in the southeast corner of Korea on the coast. This is my final night here. I just came down for the weekend because the country has such fantastic infrastructure, particularly when it comes to high-speed rail. It's very easy to get around. And this notion that the country can sell itself because of its high-tech nature, I'll come back to that when I talk about the exhibition that I've attended in Seoul, known as ADEX. And for those of you interested in military history, you might recall that Busan had a key role in the Korean War, and in the desperate early days of 1950, in the weeks following the surprise invasion by the North, the country almost went under. It was so close to being defeated, and there are still a lot of people here who are very conscious of that. So Busan was a perimeter that was fiercely defended. The North had the advantage in things like, well, when the invasion began, they had about 238 tanks, Second World War era T-34s, but the South and the few US troops here had nothing. So they were very close to being completely wiped out. So they held on at Busan while General MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, built up reserves in Japan, staged the Incheon landings, and that turned the tide of the war in the next phase. It ultimately ended in a stalemate. And this is a very important fact, and it will be relevant later when I am talking about Korean defense industry. Legally, the war with North Korea has never ended. What we have in place is an armistice, a truce, so to speak, but legally the two countries are still at war. And again, that's something that people in this country are highly conscious of. But I also just wanted to say quite a few things about what is happening at the moment in the United States. And I'm not a sociologist, but my concern is the obvious one because of America's importance as a security partner. And developments that are taking place in the US, I think are largely being ignored or at least downplayed by the Australian media and certainly by our politicians, and I am getting very worried. Anyway, the almost euphoric coverage of the Donald Trump-Anthony Albanese meeting continues to reverberate, and the problem is for semi-rational people like me, because the cult has received this huge boost of enthusiasm, it will make it even easier to ignore what I and other like-minded people are saying, namely that this is not yet a done deal for the sale of second-hand nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. Far from it. I've counted through those reasons. I won't repeat them all again today. And the mood, the way that I read it, is like this, where all of the numerous AUKUS boosters will be saying, you know, witnesses say that the moment the Australian Prime Minister shook the hand of the US President, a giant eagle passed overhead at that very moment. And the witnesses say the eagle didn't even cast a shadow. It's such an obvious sign, a sign that AUKUS has been preordained. But of course, no such thing has happened. It ain't preordained. But anyway, getting back to the state of US politics, rather than me opine, I thought I'd read a few quotes from economist and analyst Paul Krugman. Paul is a bit of a lefty and a do-gooder, but nevertheless, in my opinion, worth listening to. And he's been quoted, this is his quick summary of the situation today. Masked government agents are snatching people off the street. The National Guard has been sent into major cities on the obviously false pretext that these cities are in chaos. The US military is essentially murdering people on the high seas. He refers to blowing up these alleged drug-carrying speedboats. He continues, huge tariffs are, in addition to their economic costs, undermining a system of alliances former presidents spent generations building, including, I might say, with Australia. Green energy is being eviscerated. Vindictive prosecutions are the norm, and many millions are on course to lose their health insurance. Now, Paul Krugman also has a bit to say about a current controversy. Again, I don't know whether it's being covered in Australia, about President Trump's unilateral decision to demolish the east wing of the White House so that he can build some ghastly, I'm sure, gold-splattered ballroom. And Krugman takes aim at that, saying, yes, Trump has terrible taste and probably would, even if he didn't have power, and thanks to power, wealth. But the grotesqueness of his White House renovations is structural as well as personal. For the excess and ugliness serve a political purpose to humiliate and intimidate. The tawdry grandiosity serves not only to glorify Trump's fragile ego, but also to send the message that resistance is futile. So that's from Paul Krugman. And my basic point is this. Australians need to start considering the possibility that the US will no longer be there to protect us, and we might be reaching that point much sooner than anyone expected. Previously, my own view, and that sort of aligned with people like Professor Hugh White, was that the US was in long-term structural decline economically compared with China, and that was just a fact that would gradually play out. My own view was that we were better accepting that reality now rather than waiting for some point in the 2030s. But I am really, really concerned right now, and I think that the US is getting to the point where it is in serious danger of imploding. I'd be surprised if next November's midterm elections go ahead. And if they do, the electoral maps will be so skewed, and that's thanks to the US Supreme Court, I don't think the Democrats will win. And that's kind of it for US democracy as we know it at that point. Because if the Republicans control the Senate and Congress, and if the 2028 presidential election goes ahead, and if a Democrat wins, well, Congress will simply refuse to certify the result. And in any case, I don't think Donald Trump has any intention of leaving the White House, or what little of it remains, by 2028. And all of these things together have the most profound and worrying consequences for Australia. So what can we do about it? Well, as it turns out, the ADEX Defence Exhibition last week in Seoul is a good place to start the discussion. And I've, as regular listeners and readers know, I've been a huge enthusiast for greater cooperation with South Korea, and that level of enthusiasm has been raised even higher. The show itself, I'm told by the organisers, was bigger than Farnborough. I'm sure that many people have been to trade shows. Huge numbers of companies turn up. They're displaying all of their high-tech weaponry and sensors and things like that. So to think that this show in relatively obscure Seoul was even larger than one of the world's, until now, premier defence exhibitions in itself is mind-blowing. And I came to my first one 15 years ago, and the balance was weighted heavily in favour of US suppliers and some Europeans. Well, now, a mere decade and a half onwards, I would say it's about 80% Korean defence industry. And I'll just use as an illustration of how rapidly things are developing here the KF-21 fighter aircraft program. The KF-21 is a single-seat, twin-engined, supersonic jet fighter that Korea is developing for their own needs and for the export market. When I was chatting with people from the prime contractor, KAI, they mentioned, when I asked for an update on the program, they said that serial production had started. They've had 6 prototypes in test flights. They said that production was already underway. I said, I thought that was due to begin in 2026. Does this mean you're ahead of schedule? And they said, yes, they are. That in itself tells you a lot. It's so rare in sort of the Western world for programs of this complexity to be sticking to schedule, let alone be ahead of it. Anyway, the thing that really impressed me this time, I've been aware of the KF-21 for a while, but meeting with a lot of Korean companies and seeing the technology that they're showing is that Korea is not just developing the KF-21, they are developing the entire ecosystem around it. So it's not just the airframe, but it's the sensors, such as a radar from Hanwha, and missiles from LIG, engines from Hanwha, I think possibly made under license, but anyway. The imperative behind this and other Korean projects seems to be to keep on designing, keep on refining, keep on expanding the Korean industrial base until they can do 100% of pretty much any system. And it's actually a presidential aim or directive that Korean industry aims to be the world's 4th largest exporter by the year 2030. And to me, they look to be ahead of the curve. Now, it has always annoyed me that people assume and repeat that the US makes the best weapons. In some cases, yes, but not always. And where they are ahead, sometimes the difference is marginal. Now, you'd sort of expect me to say that because I've worked for a Swedish company and I've worked for a French company, both, developing things at the leading edge of technology. And it was always professionally frustrating to be running into this just naive assumption that anything that came from the US was always better. It's not the case. Now, as I mentioned in a previous podcast, I'm not sure which one, the rallying cry for all of the Australian AUKUS boosters is, where are the Mark 48 heavyweight torpedoes coming from? This is the pushback when I and other people say we should start diversifying further from the US. Well, the heavyweight torpedo, of course, is the principal weapon of the Collins-class submarine. Now, many countries make excellent heavyweight torpedoes: Italy, France, Germany, the UK, Sweden, and now South Korea. And when people insist on the supposed superiority of US weapons, well, just ask them to prove it. And I'll point out, speaking about torpedoes, that in the Australian inventory, on the lightweight torpedo side of things, these are things that you drop from helicopters or fire from surface ships, Australia has 2 in our inventory, the US Mark 54 and the European MU-90. And maybe on another podcast I'll go through all of that. It's a fascinating story again on how Australia stuffed up a very promising program. And I will say that between the two, the Mark 54 and the MU-90, the European one has much better performance. But you can't say that part aloud. Nor can you argue, as I've discovered, that the destroyed fleet of Taipan helicopters were much better, technically, than the US Black Hawks now replacing them. But they were. But it's the sort of thing that's very difficult to get any public acceptance of. Now, just since we're on history of mentioned Mark 48, it has an interesting developmental history. It was developed in Cold War days. Its origins go back to the 1970s, and the United States Navy had a particular problem with emerging Soviet submarines. I think it might have been the Alpha class. Small, fast, and very deep diving, had hulls made out of titanium. So the Mark 48 torpedo was developed specifically to counter that threat. And it is a very deep diving torpedo. You can probably look it up on Wiki. I don't think I'm allowed to say the number, but I am pretty sure in saying it is. It can dive deeper than any of the other heavyweight torpedoes coming from countries that I've mentioned. Now, because of this, all designs are matters of compromise, cost, schedule, performance, that sort of thing. And once you get into the technical detail, there are a myriad of compromises that need to be made. Now, because of the early design choice of the Mark 48, it's had to have been progressively updated, upgraded. So, for example, its performance in shallow waters has been improved. Now, this is just a rather long way of saying, sure, it's a good torpedo, it's an effective torpedo, but there are alternatives. And so I say to all of these people, well, where do we get the Mark 48s from? Well, we can look at other suppliers. And if the combat system on the Collins, the US combat system, cannot be modified to fire another torpedo, I would be very, very surprised. However, I know how the Department of Defense operates, and what they will say is, oh no, we couldn't possibly do that because that would be too risky. Now, this is one of the characteristics of the Department of Defense that has frustrated me and others for years. It's the selective use of risk. When they don't want something to happen, they'll label it as, oh, that's just too high risk, and that puts an end to it. On the other hand, when they do want something that's high risk, they just ignore it. And the classic case, of course, is the Hunter-class frigate program. And again, I'll talk more about that in other podcasts. It's a huge topic. But clearly, one of the many reasons why that program is delayed and why I think there are profound budgetary problems is because of the level of risk involved. It was even identified during the evaluation phase, but then conveniently overlooked because there were plenty of people who wanted the British design, and it didn't matter if it was high risk, it didn't matter if it was extreme risk, they were still going to get what they wanted. Now, I'm going to circle back to the KF-21, because I will say at the moment, when I look at the Australian inventory, it is true that there is no alternative to the F-35. Excellent aircraft. I've been a big supporter of the program. It has some critics. It's not perfect. The aircraft are more expensive to operate, to maintain than predicted, but nevertheless, it's a genuine fifth-generation stealthy aircraft. So we have no choice for the moment if we want to buy a really top-line fighter aircraft. But other options are being developed. There are a number of sixth-generation platforms underway, design underway. I think that Australia should definitely consider becoming involved as an observer in some of those. But back to the KF-21. The next iteration, the sort of Block 3 version of the aircraft, will enter the stealth domain because it will have the internal carriage of weapons. The designers have left space there, so it's a matter of mechanical engineering, very complex mechanical engineering, I'll grant you that. But this development is well underway. There are other things necessary to achieve truly high levels of stealth. You've got to have certain coatings. You've also got to worry about things like the weapons bay doors, the design of those, the speed at which they open and close. So I'm not for a moment suggesting that this is trivial. I'm not suggesting that the internal carriage of weapons solves everything. It gets you a long way there, but there are other things that need to be done. Now, my view of Korean defense industry, again, very much boosted by the time that I've spent at ADEX in a number of meetings, is they are going to succeed. They are going to do it. The record of South Korean defense industry is quite extraordinary in being able to grow rapidly, develop their own technologies, often based on imported solutions from the 1990s, but they are now getting to the point of being able to sell entire self-contained weapons systems like the KF-21, or like their submarines, or like some of their surface ships. And wise Australian politicians and wise Australian defence planners should rid themselves of the fallacy that AUKUS and the United States is going to fix our security problems, and they should be looking much more closely at what can be done in this country. That's it from me. Goodbye from Korea. Thank you very much for listening, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.